Right, this is your last story tonight, kids.
Aww, Mom.
Settle down now. Many years ago, in a land far, far away, there lived a lady called Barbara. Barbara had one of the biggest smiles the world had ever seen. She smiled for everyone, the trees, the animals, and all of the people she saw. She only stopped smiling when she saw something wrong. Barbara had a baby daughter called Valentine. Valentine made Barbara smile a lot, but the country where Barbara lived was not safe. So she escaped to Britain. She knew that she and Valentine would be safe there. When they arrived, Barbara had to go to a place called Luna House to get special papers so she and Valentine could stay in Britain. They had to queue for hours in the cold and the rain in a place called the cattle shed. Barbara was not smiling now, but there was nothing she could do.
What's a cattle shed?
It's where cows and sheep sleep.
Ew.
Barbara was brave and decided something must be done. She talked to Citizens UK, which is made up of lots and lots of churches and mosques and schools in the area, who always work together to make things better for ordinary people. Barbara told citizens about the cattle shed at Luna House. Everyone was angry, and so they went straight to Luna House and demanded to meet the person in charge. They waited a long time, but in the end, the person in charge agreed to get rid of the cattle shed and replace it with a welcome center that cost almost £1 million.
Wow.
This made Barbara smile, a smile so big that it lit up her house for days and days. Nobody would have to wait in the cold and the rain ever again. But one day, Barbara heard the news that turned her smile upside down. Some friends from her country had been taken from their home in London and locked up with their 3 children in a place called Yarl detention centre.
What's a detention centre, Mummy?
Well, Barbara soon found out when she went to visit, it was like a prison. It had guards, barbed wire, and nowhere to get out. And the children were scared. Imagine your bedroom door being locked from outside. But in the middle of the night, you would be woken up by a guard shining a torch in your eyes to check if you were not dead.
Why were they being locked up, Mum? Had they done something naughty?
No, Eunice. It's just that people in charge could put you in detention if you'd ask for special papers to stay in Britain. Over 1,000 innocent children, just like you and your brother, were locked up every year.
1,000 children like us. Didn't the really powerful people do anything to help? Like the Queen. She's a nice lady.
Well, Barbara couldn't believe it. The powerful people agreed that it was sad, but said it just had to happen. At Christmas, Barbara felt sorry for the children who were locked up. So she called up Santa Claus and asked him to deliver gifts to them. But what do you think happened?
Did Santa get stuck in the chimney?
No, Eunice. He got stuck at security. The nasty guards at Yarl couldn't let Santa in. They even called the police. Barbara was definitely not smiling now. Do you remember that Barbara was a brave woman? So she made a plan with the friends from Citizens to get the children out of detention. They gave themselves a name, Citizens for Sanctuary, and got lots of powerful leaders like the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Chief Rabbi to support the Sanctuary Pledge.
What's a pledge?
A pledge is like a promise.
What were they promising to do?
They were promising to do everything in their power to stop children being locked up in places like Yarl. Barbara knew that soon the people of Britain had to vote for which people they wanted to be in charge of the country. So Barbara and Citizens trained hundreds of their friends to persuade the people who wanted to be in charge to sign the Sanctuary Pledge. And guess what? It worked! One by one, hundreds of people who wanted to be in charge across Britain started to agree with Barbara that innocent children should not be locked up. Barbara smiled. Her plan was working. But there were 3 people with very special powers who wanted to be in charge but had not yet signed the Sanctuary Pledge. If they didn't sign it, then all of the hard work that all of the citizens had done might be wasted.
Who are the 3 people with special powers, Mum? Was it Superman, Spider-Man and Batman?
Well, James, you could call them that, but most people call them Mr. Brown, Mr. Cameron and Mr. Clegg. So, just before the big vote, citizens invited Mr. Brown, Mr. Cameron and Mr. Clegg to come to a big meeting in London called an assembly. Barbara was there and so were thousands of other people. Everyone was on the edge of their seats waiting to hear if Mr. Brown, Mr. Cameron, Mr. Clegg would sign the Sanctuary Pledge. Do you remember what a pledge is?
It's a promise.
That's right. First up, Mr. Clegg came to the stage. He said, "Yes, let us put an end to the shameful practice of locking up small, innocent children." Barbara started to smile. But next up was Mr. Cameron. Nobody was sure what he was going to say. "What happens now is not acceptable. Not acceptable at all. If I'm in charge, I will stop locking up children and work with citizens to find good alternatives." Everyone cheered and Barbara's smile got wider. And then, disaster.
What, Mum? What?
Mr. Brown did his speech and everyone said it was great. So great that they completely forgot to ask him about the Sanctuary Pledge. People shouted, "What about the Sanctuary Pledge?" But he had already gone. Barbara's smile went away. But the very next day, she got a letter from Mr. Brown saying that he would sign the Sanctuary Pledge. So now all the men with special powers supported the Sanctuary Pledge, and that made Barbara smile from ear to ear. A few days later, the big vote took place. And do you know who won?
Was it Mr. Brown?
No, James. In fact, no one really won. So Mr. Cameron and Mr. Clegg shared the job of being in charge of the country and told everyone that they would stop locking up children in places like Yarl's Wood. Even the Queen agreed. She went to Parliament in a golden carriage and told everyone, "My government will end the detention of children for immigration purposes." Now, Barbara worked with Miss Tether, Mr. Clegg's friend, and Mr. Green, Mr. Cameron's friend, and lots of experts to find ways that we could stop locking up children in places like Yarl's Wood. After a while, Barbara went to see Mr. Clegg, who was now called the Deputy Prime Minister. "Mr. Clegg, my friends and I have waited a long time for this day. We have fought hard and we have worked with you to find alternatives. So, could you give us an exact date when this country will stop locking up innocent children and their families?"
Wow, that was brave. What did Mr. Clegg say?
Mr. Clegg looked Barbara straight in the eye, shook her hand and said, "I think we can do that, Barbara. I know that Mr. Cameron agrees too. I promise that within 1 year, no more children from your communities will be locked up." And Mr. Clegg did just that. Barbara went home to Valentine and gave her a huge hug and then smiled one of the biggest smiles the world had ever seen. And so ends the story of Barbara the Brave and how hundreds of ordinary people made sure that the children were let out of detention centers like Yarl's Wood, never to return there again.
Can I be like Barbara when I grow up, Mum?
We can't all be heroes, but we can be good citizens.
How can I do that?
It's simple, but you have to be brave. You have to stand up, take charge, work with others, hold powerful people to account, and just do what Barbara did. Keep smiling, and when you see something that's wrong, keep fighting to make it right. That's how you change the world.